All right, hello. Just for the recording, may I ask what your name is?
My name is Harry Meyer, Meyer, from Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm. And so, what is your affiliation with the Korean War?
Well, in 1948, I enlisted in the Army after spending 1 year at Rutgers University. And then I enlisted in the Army because it was a draft and I chose to enlist. And I was assigned to the military police. And in September of 1950, we were given orders to go to relieve a military police battalion in Yokohama, Japan. I went through Seattle, Washington to Fort Lewis and sailed across the Pacific, got to Yokohama, but they would not let us off. They told us that we were going to North Korea because the North Koreans had invaded, South Korea. So I was on a ship, did not get off in Yokohama, and I started there in the military police to help the evacuation of the military created by that. So that's how I was affiliated with it. And right now I'm on the board of directors of the Lancaster chapter of Korean War veterans. There are close to 100 of us, and it's the second largest Korean War veteran chapter in the United States. So I'm pretty active in that, have been in that, and I've been in the Chosin Reservoir evacuation. So that's a brief summary of how I got there and what I did not expect when I enlisted, but nevertheless, an experience that I'll never forget.
Right. Can you repeat exactly when you enlisted again?
I beg your pardon?
When exactly did you enlist?
In October 1st, 1948.
Right. So this was before the Korean War, right?
That's correct.
So what was sort of your reasoning then behind wanting to enlist in the Army? Or sorry, wait, which branch were you?
I was in the Army, in the military police, which I found out later on. But to get back to your question, Eric, the World War II draft was still on in 1947. I graduated from high school in 1947. And you had to enlist in the service. And you had an option of either being drafted for 18 months with 5 years of reserve responsibility when you were discharged, or you could enlist for 2 years and not have any reserve responsibility. So I chose to enlist for 2 years, which would have meant I would have been discharged in 1950, but that did not happen because the Korean War broke out and the President of the United States, Harry Truman, froze all the discharges. So on a 24-month enlistment, I served 39 months.
And so once you enlisted, then where did you receive training?
Well, my basic training was in Fort Dix, New Jersey. And then I went to MP school in Georgia. And then I was assigned to Governor's Island in New York Harbor, in the military police battalion, which was the First Army headquarters then at the end of World War II. And I did military police duty on Governor's Island and also at the United Nations. The United Nations just opened, and we were in honor guard that for the military police that went to the United Nations on regular duty. And that was our original introduction. That would have been in 1949.
Mm-hmm. So basically you enlisted in 1948 and then you received training until 1949?
Until 1949, correct.
And then once you did that, you shipped out to Japan then?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Under the assumption we were going to relieve a World War II military police battalion in Yokohama, Japan. They were there as occupation, but the war changed that when we were there.
Mm-hmm.
We left for Japan at the Korean War started, as you know, on June 25th, 1950. So I sailed out of Washington Fort Lewis, Washington in September of 1950, not knowing that I was going to go to Korea.
Right. So once you arrived in Korea, do you recall what exactly you saw?
Well, I saw a great deal. We got into the harbor. We were loaded with combat equipment. First of all, we stopped in Japan, in Kobe, Japan, around the southwestern side, and we picked up live ammunition, and we were assigned to go to North Korea. That's the first time we knew that we were going to go into combat. So what happened was we ended up over the side. The vessel was the Corporal Fred C. Ainsworth was the Merchant Marine troop ship. We went over the side, across the side, and then down into Higgins boats, and we landed in North Korea, in Hungnam. And that's when we ended up going house to house, evacuating and going up to the Chosin Reservoir, because the 1st Marine Division was surrounded by the Chinese. So we ended up going up there, and we got cut off and evacuated, okay, civilians and military. We were attached to the 1st Marine Division. They did not have military police. At least I didn't realize if they ever did or not, or still don't. But we were attached to the 1st Marine Division, and our 88th MP Company, 88th Military Police Company, was attached to the 10th Corps. The 10th Corps was headed by General Almond, and we went up into the trails up to North Korea and opened the roads with evacuating refugees, going house to house, taking civilians and having them march down from the Chosin Reservoir down to the Hungnam Harbor, which was a significant distance for a lot of those people. Weather was very poor. It was 25, 30 below with regularity. And it was sniper fire at the time that we were doing the patrol and opening the road for the military. The military were tens of thousands. It was the largest evacuation since Dunkirk. You might not have heard Dunkirk, but Dunkirk was a significant evacuation by the British during World War II from Dunkirk across the English Channel. This was the 2nd largest evacuation. And there were over 100,000 civilians. Okay, women, children, A-frames, mama-sans, papa-sans, all of those civilians that knew. And really, Eric, one of the things that I learned since then was that the fear that the civilians had was the communist oppression. Okay, and there were many, many Christian missionaries in North Korea, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Catholics, and the population there was afraid of religious persecution. And in all the history about the Korean War, that's not been too prevalent. But I've since learned that in terms of my research and what I've done since then. So the civilians left their homes. They brought furniture, A-frames, things of that nature, and got to the beach. And we loaded the civilians on board Victory ships, LSTs, landing ship tank originally, but then became landing ship transport. And we loaded 3,000-4,000 at a time into the vessels. And that evacuation was in December of 1950. The prior month, we did a lot of house to house to get evacuations out, because the intention was to evacuate as many civilians and the retreat of the military by evacuating North Korea. So we moved out on Christmas Eve. I was the 2nd last vessel left. The battleship Missouri was in the harbor. We were loading men, loading women and children inside the vessels. And I'll tell you another point later on that would, I think, be of interest relative to that evacuation. So the last of us left on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1950. I was the second last ship out of the harbor at that point, and we sailed down to Pusan. It was 15 to 20 below. There were thousands and thousands in the holds below. And there's some follow-up stories there, and I can share some of those with you from a humanitarian point of view, but most of the refugees were below in the holes, and we were on top of the deck, and it was pretty cold, as you can imagine, as I'm sure you heard of, Kim, in that period of time. And we were designated to go into Pusan, now Busan. They changed the P to a B. Mm-hmm. I never knew why, but at any rate, I always still pronounce it Pusan. But we never could get off because the vessels were too heavily loaded. And we went to Ulsan, just up the harbor, and that's where we unloaded men, women, and children, but the vessels could not get to the beach. So what we did was we unloaded men, women, and children in cargo nets. There were tenders of small boats that pulled alongside of us, and we loaded men, women, and children, screaming, frightened at the time, in the cargo nets, and then those cargo nets put the people into these tenders, small motorboats, fishing boats, things of that nature. And that's how we evacuated the vessel. And I'll tell you about a vessel later on, because the captain of that vessel is a very prominent individual today in the Catholic faith, which I'll tell you about. But I'll let you go on with your questions, and I'd like to get back to that because that's a very prominent thing that's in existence today that I'm sure you'd be interested in.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I'm very interested to hear about that too.
Well, what happened was there was a vessel, and there's a book written about this, and it's called the Meredith Victory, Ship of Miracles. And the captain of that vessel, okay, when he was discharged, he was called Captain LaRue, Brother Marinus, and he became a Catholic monk in Newton, New Jersey. Excuse me. Fast forward that story, he passed away there at Newton, New Jersey. This would have been in the early 60s. And he was elevated as a saint in the Catholic Church, and that's still pending. And this Captain LaRue, who was buried in an abbey in Newton, New Jersey, where, believe it or not, my daughters live, and I'll tell you about that tie-in personally in the family. But Captain LaRue, and we have pictures of that. And when my daughter and grandson were hiking about 8 or 10 years ago, they were hiking at the Abbey, which was a large facility, and they were cutting down Christmas trees. And when they went to the gift shop, there were monks there. And the publication called the Meredith Victory book was on the display tables. And my daughter Barbara said to the monk behind the counter, "Oh, my father was in the Korean War." And the monk behind the counter said, "Oh, the captain, there's a burial here of a Brother Marinus." That was his ordained name. Brother Marinus is buried here. So my daughter Barbara and my grandson Ryan, Barbara's now in her 60s, and grandson Ryan is a paramedic today in Baltimore, Maryland. And what happened was she took pictures of the gravesite. So now the story goes on, and it's almost over, Eric. But what happened was, and I hope I'm not boring you with this information.
No, that's okay.
What happened was that I received a publication from a friend of mine who was also in the Korean War and was a member of the Catholic Church in Naples, Florida. And the Diocese of Florida had a big publication about Brother Marinus, Captain LaRue, and the fact that he was elevated to the Vatican for sainthood.
Wow.
And that's still pending. So we don't know the status of that yet, but I did have contact with the Monsignor in that parish relative to the status of that. So going way back when, the man who captained the vessel that had 4,500 in it, okay, is now being considered as a saint in the Catholic Church. That's a very unusual story that not too many people know about. So we're waiting to hear if that takes place. But it's ironic that my daughter, 25 years later, found out this gravesite in her hometown, and the place where the abbey is was called St. Paul's Abbey. And that's where Captain LaRue, Brother Marinus, was buried. So we'll know down the road whether sainthood takes place. I don't know the way that works, but that's the status of it.
I see. So going back to your experiences in Korea, then, was there any specific, I guess, interaction with the Korean citizens that you recall during these evacuations?
Well, we carried them. There were lines on the beach overnight. We carried them and had to load them. I carried women and children screaming, okay, loading these women and children. And they came there. And one of the things that, and it was very, very upsetting to me to do that, okay, but we loaded them in and we had to carry them into the LSTs, because if you know an LST, it's the vessel where the bow opens in the front, and that's where they loaded tanks in that originally in World War II, but now they use it for all kinds of transportation, heavy equipment and things of that nature. So I was carrying women and children, and one of the biggest single things that impressed me about that piece was that the elderly remained back. They chose to have their spouses and children be evacuated, and they remained back. So the families on the beach voluntarily separated. And that's a situation that was most heart-wrenching, because you can appreciate tens of thousands of families. There were over 100,000 civilians evacuated in that 2-week period of time in December of 1950. And my interaction with them, of course, was there. And then, of course, prior to that, in December and November, I did military police duty with the ROK Police, the Republic of Korea Police in North Korea, in those particular areas, and in South Korea. So I had a chance to do different things and learn how to calculate on an abacus and do all the things that was done there by the ROK Police that we shared. And we went house to house together because they were our interpreters. And what was challenging about that assignment, Eric, it's like trying to tell the difference between people from North Carolina in the United States and South Carolina. Everybody looks alike. Mm-hmm. So it was very hard. And each of us that went house to house along the trails to evacuate people, we shared that responsibility as a duo with the ROK Police, who had to interpret for me, okay, and others of my military police battalion. Okay, so that's how the interaction, in answer to your question, was with the civilians there.
Right. So you said that you were basically loading them over a 2-week period. So what happens? What did the American Army try to do in order to help like the civilians then who were waiting for like these ships to come and pick them up?
Well, not everybody was there for a 2-week period of time, but there were animals there were oxen and so forth, and people brought their food or whatever they had there, and they were lined up on the beaches, and the pictures would show this to you specifically in terms of that. And it's very evident that maybe you would like this. About a year ago, the chaplain of where we live interviewed me, and I have a DVD and a thumb drive of that interview. And if you would like that, I would be able to share that with you. That might give you a very firsthand personal experience of what was done by a professional film photographer on that, and that would give you some added information if you chose to do that. But that's pretty much what happened with the civilian interaction. But when to show you what happened on board the vessel, when I talked to Captain LaRue's first mate, who lived in New York, and I located him, and he and I became friends. He said that when they were pulling out of the harbor, he learned that there were 4 berths on ship.
Wow.
On the trip from North Korea to South Korea. And Lieutenant Lunny said to Captain LaRue, what else was disturbing was that they were cooking on hibachis in a hold below, but the hibachis were on 55-gallon gasoline drums in the vessel below, and that was always kind of cute in terms of knowing, because you know these people brought a lot of their personal possessions. We wouldn't allow animals or furniture on board for obvious reasons. So they separated that. So that's a little inside story in terms of the interaction with the Army and the military police at the time.
Mm-hmm. And going back to like the ships then, where you actually loaded the people, how many people were able to fit on each ship, and how many?
Well, I can't tell you each ship, but the largest vessel was the Meredith Victory, and this is all in this book called The Ship of Miracles, and that had 4,500. Now the capacity of that was about 1,000 to 1,200, and some were that small, but the largest one was the Meredith Victory. I was in it. The Meredith Victory was a merchant marine vessel, which was not an LST. I was loading on board the LST, although in the harbor, the Meredith Victory was moored, and I was watching that because there was another group of military police loading people on board the Meredith Victory. I didn't know then. Now, you got to remember this, Eric, I was 21 years old. I didn't know what the capacity of those vessels were. I learned all this later on, especially when I read the biographical history of Brother Marinus, Captain LaRue. So that was pretty much so. There were smaller, mid-sized vessels or what have you from the Army Corps of Engineers and so forth. So that's usually, in answer to your question, it varied by size of the vessel.
All right. So before enlisting, then what was your overall perception of just Korea and East Asia in general? Were you aware of where it was?
When I got to Japan, I didn't even know where Korea was. Okay, I was 21 years old. I knew of Oriental people, then called Orientals rather than Asians, because when I grew up in New York and in New Jersey, we had Japanese people, students in our class. There was and I think he was a Korean, but a Korean boy who, either that or a Japanese boy who played with me when I was a little kid below 6 years old. So my relationship with them was as a child growing up in school. And, you know, we had no attitude of indifference to that segment of the population at all, in terms of where that was. Now, we got to remember, this was before World War II. So things changed then, created by the American attitude toward the Asians, with internment camps being built in the West Coast that I'm sure you're probably aware of what happened during that period of time. But you got to remember, this was 1935. I was 6 years old. in New York, on the streets of Brooklyn. You heard of Brooklyn, New York?
Yeah.
That's where I was born and raised there for a short period of time till I moved to New Jersey.
Right. So during this period, then when you were growing up, where did you go to high school, or where did you go to school in New Jersey?
Well, my family moved from Brooklyn, New York to New Jersey for business reasons. It was the Depression economic period of time.
Right.
My father owned a couple of delicatessens, which were food stores. If you heard that name today, they're in supermarkets, but then they were independents. And then he bought a business in New Jersey, and I went to school in New Jersey, 2 grammar schools, Union Hill High School in Hudson County, and then New Jersey, and then that's a county right opposite the Manhattan Island on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River. And then I went to Rutgers University from 1947 to 1948, but it wasn't a university then, it was a college. And then I had my college education interrupted by enlisting in the Korean War. I mean, enlisting in the Army.
Right. So after you returned from Korea, then did you just continue going to college and, pursuing your major?
Yes, I went to finish with Rutgers, and then went at night. I was married, had some children, and went to school at night. Got a job. Went to work for Nabisco, the cookie company. You've probably heard that name before.
Yeah.
And then after 5 years of working for them, I became an insurance agent for Allstate Insurance Company in 1956. And so I spent 60 years in the insurance industry and did everything in that industry, okay, from being an agent in personal lines insurance and business insurance and commercial insurance and life, health, pension insurance and international insurance. And I was on the board of directors when I left for CNA Insurance Company, which is a large commercial insurance company. And I was the chief operating officer of that company when I left.
Wow.
I was also on the board of a Japanese insurance company. And the Japanese insurance company that I was on a board with, okay, was called Chiyoda. And Chiyoda was the company that Toyota had as an insurance company. And my insurance company in the United States, CNA, were the financial forerunners of that company. And if you notice, the word Toyota sounds like Chiyoda.
Mm-hmm.
And the Toyota car, that company, that Toyota family, their family name was with a D, Toyda. And a clerical mistake made the D a T, and that's how it stuck.
Right. So from what it seems, then your reintegration into society after the Korean War was pretty smooth then. Would you say that's true?
Well, by the definition of smooth, other than the fact that we were coming out of a depressed economy, and it was solid work all the time as a teenager, as a young adult, okay, in terms of, remember, I grew up in the 35s and late 30s, 40s during World War II times as a teenager. And then in the 50s when things were a little bit different. There were not as many luxuries as there were survival attitudes on the part of people, particularly with World War II veterans leaving and being discharged and so forth. So if you want to call that smooth, in retrospect, I don't necessarily refer to that as smooth because there were a lot of us that were working 65, 70 hours a week as routine, okay, to survive financially and raise a family.
Mm-hmm. So once coming back from Korea, then what was society's perspective of the Korean War? Because I've heard from a lot of people that it's called the Forgotten War in America. So what was your experience when coming back from the Korean War?
Well, let me give you the attitude on the part of the Forgotten War. Society wanted to forget that because you got to remember that World War II ended in 1945. So there were still many families who were suffering from the loss of loved ones during the World War II. And for them to end up experiencing comparable sacrifices of having that occurrence in their mind within 5 years. Remember, it started June 25th, 1950. So there was only that 5-year space. And those who avoided draft in the World War II because of age, now was draft age in the Korean War 5 years later. So if you were 15, 16, you were not drafted, you were eligible when you graduated from high school. But then within 5 years, you would be eligible to draft, and that's when I enlisted. So first of all, technology was not in existence then. Korea was a long, long world way away. Not too many people were aware of it. Not too many people understood why President Truman decided to go to war, in Korea. And basically, the United States needed an Asian foothold, which today, Korea is one of the largest shipbuilding countries in the world, the largest steel companies in the world, one of the 6th largest economy in the world, all as a result of occupation of the United States and the military. But that grew with time. There were not too many people, even today, there are. People talk about World War I, World War II, Vietnam, but the Korean War is absent because people wanted to, quote, forget about that, sociologically speaking. Not resentful at all, but just the fact that they wanted it to go away, but it never did, because we lost 36,000 military in the Korean War, and there were still 8,000 MIAs that we get reports on missing in action in North Korea. So that's how that's the fundamental of the attitude of the Korean War.
Right. So seeing as Korea is, I guess, developed like to an exponential like extent, where it's sort of developed into one of the largest economies in the world, how has that sort of made you feel about your time in Korea?
Well, I was always very excuse me. I think in retrospect, I always had an admiration for the Korean population. I'm going to tell you a number of reasons why in a moment. I found them to be, they revered the elderly. They were very bright. They were ambitious. They communicated well. Those who learned, they were anxious to be integrated in our society, as a population. And I learned that because my cousin, who was 5 years younger than me, adopted 2 Korean children when they were 3 and 4 years old. So today I have 12 extended family Koreans in my extended family. Mm-hmm. And fast forward that story, one of them became a patent attorney, a gal in Robin in the legal profession. Then Tom, her brother, was the imaging director of Cleveland Clinic in photography before you go there for an MRI and so forth. So they were very, very ambitious. And that was one thing I always admired about the Korean people in general. So that was my feeling about them. Having been there, it was obvious I was glad to get back. I rotated through and came back the following October of 1951, and then was discharged, because you got to remember my discharge was frozen. On a 24-month enlistment, I served 39 months with the last 13 or 14 in Korea. So when I came back from Korea, rotating, then they rotated you on combat points, and 21 was kind of the goal, and I guess I had 35 being in 3 or 4 campaigns, battle campaigns. But so I never resented going there. I understood what happened. I was very sympathetic and empathetic. And I could relate to that because my grandparents from Germany, okay, and I'm first generation born in this country, and I remember my mother and father being immigrants in this country coming through Ellis Island. So I had some form of identification with the emotional feeling on the part of that identification. For me personally, as a child, family experience, military experience, and my own experience.
Since returning from Korea, then have you ever gone back to Korea and seen what it's become, like for your own eyes, or have you only been able to look at it from afar?
Well, we never really went back to Korea. Was very active in the Korean War Veterans Association in the United States. You got to remember that the carve out of the Korean War Veterans Association was an organization called the Chosen Few. And the Chosen Few is still in existence for those of us who were in the evacuation and the military conflict of the Chosen Few. See, nobody wanted to ever call it a war. They always called it a conflict because the declaration of war had some kind of political negative aspect of it as an impact on society. So, quote, being facetious, it wasn't a Korean war, it was a Korean conflict. Well, when as many fatalities in the military were. And I think I grew to learn a great deal about the fact that the rationale behind why the United States maintained its occupancy. Remember, that was very untrue, and today is subject to discussion and controversy about our foothold in other countries, whether it be Afghanistan or Baghdad or what have you. But we remained there, and one of the deep reasons is that we needed to keep, as a country, to this day, we need to keep a foothold in some areas of the continents created by the oppression from opposition, whatever it may be. So I never did go back, but learned a lot, gave a lot of presentations, belonged to a lot of organizations, have been active in the world of remembrance here in Lancaster County. And so I, between my family, my military service, my combat service over there, I have an emotional attachment for the whole Korean, quote, conflict or war, if you will.
So when you talked about the Chosen Few, then do you still keep in contact with any of your, I guess, comrades who were involved in the evacuation with you?
Well, there are very few of us that are alive. Our chapter here has 91 of us active now. I think we're at over 100 at one given time. Many of them have predeceased me. I'm 91 years old.
Wow.
And I'm going to be 92. But, you know, my daughters, you can appreciate this. I have grandchildren your age and just had a great grandson.
Oh,
but my daughter said,
congratulations.
thank you. My daughters say to me, Dad, 92 is not your age, it's your IQ. And they tease me, you know, in terms of that. I said, no, my IQ is a little bit better than that. So I'm blessed, Kim, very much with a long life. Have a beautiful family. And as the grandchildren get older, your age, now they're in their 20s, and they express an interest in this more than not as much as I would like, I should say, but that's the passing of time that does that. I have a very big interest in World War II and in the German period of time. As my family had those difficulties, as you have an interest in what has happened in your society, in your culture, and I admire you extensively that you as a person have that historical feeling about wanting to learn more about the times that your predecessors went through. my cousin's adopted son, the young man who was in Cleveland Clinic today, his grandfather was an evacuee at the Chosen Few.
Mm-hmm.
And he remembers that only slightly because his grandfather passed away, but he said that he was loaded on one of those LSTs. And I could have carried his wife, and children or what have you, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But so he's very close to that attitude.
So you also
am I answering your questions to your
yeah,
satisfaction?
they are. Yeah, you are. I want to go back to your involvement then in the Korean Veterans Association, I believe, right? The Lancaster division. What has the Lancaster division sort of done locally?
Well, we've been. It's very interesting because currently right now we are, and I'll take you backwards because right now, as a matter of fact, within the past week, we are delivering plaques from a steel company, the largest steel manufacturer in Japan. I'm sorry, in Korea, who made these beautiful plaques for us, and they sent us 81 of these plaques. And we're delivering those plaques created by COVID and the lack of socialization that we can't give the right. We would love to have this as a commemoration ceremony, but it's just impossible with COVID being as susceptible because so many of us this age are very high risk. Right. So I just finished delivering 8 of them to Korean War veterans who were in the Korean War in 1950 to 53. The armistice was signed in 1953, as you know. Mm-hmm. So that's the most recent thing that we're doing. And the board of directors, 7 of us have volunteered to deliver these to these families, recognize that, and they're very, very pretty and very nice plaques that were sent to us by the steel company in appreciation with a very nice thank you letter, okay, for the service of the Korean War veterans on the 70th anniversary, which was last year, but COVID stopped us from any major recognition for the 70th anniversary. Going prior to that, we run quarterly meetings. We are big in education. What we do is, and I was part of this, we go to schools, history teachers, sociologists love to hear stories for their children. And we've gone to high schools and did a college in New Jersey myself years ago, and to try to keep the activity and the knowledge alive, similar to what you're interested in. So we have done that in terms of that, the chapter, the Korean War chapter, okay, has done that.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I think that's all
we were also.
Oh yeah.
Let me interrupt.
Yeah.
We were also very active in the solicitation for the Korean War remembrance memorial from Washington. Mm-hmm. That's being built right now.
Right, the Wall of Remembrance.
Correct.
Yeah.
So we were very active here, and I guess we was able to collect a significant amount of money from the population here in recognition of that, and that was very much appreciated. But I don't know how far away we are from that Wall of Remembrance. I haven't heard too much about it recently, but that was something else we were very active in within the past year or two.
All right. Well, thank you. That's all the questions I have for today. Thank you for your time, and thank you so much for this interview.
You're welcome.